In this video, we will be covering the final part and the deepest tiers of the largest Roman iceberg I've ever seen. I custom made this iceberg so it contains a bunch of entries not seen anywhere else, and honestly, some of them are so insane, I didn't even think they were real. But grab a drink, my choice today is water, which I am all out of. And join me as we explore the bottom final tiers of the ultimate Roman iceberg. The Roman state still exists. So this entry refers to the Ottoman takeover of the Eastern Roman Empire. And while it was mostly a complete takeover of the empire, there was this small area called Mania, which the Ottomans weren't actually able to take over. It remained out of their control, and so this is another theory about the continuation of the Roman Empire, saying that the Roman citizens and the institution and basically the essence of the empire survived in Mania. And then through a series of political and military events, this led in ways to the modern Greek Republic. Saturnalia was a Roman festival dedicated to the god of Saturn. And this festival took place around the end of the year, in the end of December. And this is when people drank, they ate great foods in abundance if they could, they exchanged gifts, they had a merry time, they danced around, and does this sound a little bit familiar? Everyone stopped working, they closed down businesses, just for the festive period. And everyone, slaves included, were given what was called a freedman's cap, which was a cone-shaped hat of sorts that symbolized the freedom and the freeness and the liberty of this festival. Slaves who were obviously normally not free, they were given temporary rights to say things and do things that they couldn't normally say and do. They were allowed to often sit at the table with their masters, and they were actually waited upon for their food and drinks. Cicero, or Cicero, was a very interesting and diverse character. So he was, among many other things, a writer, an academic, a politician, a statesman, and a speaker, a lawyer, a thinker, and he lived around the time of the Roman Republic, and he actually lived through the revolt and death of Julius Caesar, with Cicero himself being put to death shortly after. We have firstly a bunch of basically historical events or accounts written by him, and these have helped us understand what was going on at the time. But we also have, I think more importantly, huge amounts of written thoughts, ideas, works written by him exploring everything from law to philosophy, science, history, morality, and politics, with him actually inventing several new words in Latin, like humanitas, or humanity, qualitas and quantitas, or quality and quantity, evidentia, and it is said that the rediscovery of a lot of Cicero's works basically led to and sparked the start of the Renaissance, which was a time in Europe after the medieval period, and was a time of enlightenment, of free thinking and thought, of perhaps some political changes, and Cicero's works were a large factor in this. He also influenced many modern philosophers, like for example John Locke in England, and John Locke is often thought of as the founder or father of liberalism, and of course with him being in England, this influenced the English settlers in America, and then this influenced the founding of America, and the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution, and the Republic. And the basis for a lot of these ideas comes from Cicero himself. Now, Cicero did study a lot of the ancient Greeks, a lot of the Greek philosophy and the political system and morality systems. So the Greeks do deserve massive credit for inspiring this, with people like Plato and the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, as well as Polybius, who was a great Greek historian. But Cicero did do a great job of learning all about the Greeks, of translating a bunch of ideas over into Latin, and also with coming up with a bunch of his own ideas and concepts. So yeah, I think Cicero's not talked about as often as he should be, seeing as he was like the great-great-grandfather of this free thinking we have in the West. But maybe now you've heard the name of Cicero, you will bring it up when you're 5 beers deep in a bar on a Friday night. I don't know. But Long live Cicero. The Battle of Cannae was a major battle in the Punic Wars between Hannibal and Rome. It is often dubbed as one of the greatest strategic victories by Hannibal and one of the worst defeats ever faced by Rome. And I won't go over the entire battle. There are many battle simulation videos out there if you want to see it like live action, which I would recommend. But basically, Hannibal was outnumbered, but through some incredible tactics and maneuvering, he basically outsmarted the Romans. He caught them in a trap and killed roughly 53,000 of them, which was roughly like 65-70% of the Roman army, and he only lost himself around 6,000, meaning that in a single day, around about 60,000 people died in that battle, which when compared with the Battle of Gettysburg, which is often cited as the bloodiest battle in the US Civil War, in the Battle of Gettysburg there was roughly 7,000 soldiers killed, and this was over 3 days, whereas this battle had 60,000 killed in just a single day. And it's hard to put into perspective just how brutal and bloody that must have been. 3,000 tons of dead humans just abandoned, left on the battlefield to rot, with an estimated 45,000 gallons of blood spilled. So Hannibal was an absolute unit around this time, but as we explored earlier, Rome kind of went around, attacked their capital city, and finally put an end to this war. The Silkworm Smuggling is an absolutely wild part of Roman history. So silk, as we all know, is a very sought after product, and it was at the time in the 6th century mostly being made in China and India. And Justinian, the Roman emperor at the time, he basically wanted to change this. He wanted to get his sticky little grubby paws into the silk industry, and so he planned a heist of some silkworms from China into the Roman Empire. So he would actually send these monks over to China, and they would procure some silkworm eggs from wherever they got them, and they would open up their canes, which were hollowed out on the inside, and then they would put some silkworm eggs in, close up the top, and they would sneak them all the way back to Byzantium. And from there, they took the eggs, they hatched silkworms, and they started their own Roman silk farms. And it kind of actually freaking worked. Prior to this, the Romans had also smuggled out mulberry plants, which the silkworms needed to survive. And so they actually managed to smuggle out an entire industry and started producing silk directly in the empire. And granted, the Indian and Chinese silk was higher quality and it was more expensive and more sought after, but for regular everyday silk, this was a heist of the highest order, which is hilarious and amazing and insane. The Battle of the Caudine Fork was not really even a battle. It was a trap that took place in 321 AD, and this was during the Second War between Rome, at the time really quite small, and Samnium. And the Samnites, very sneakily, they sent out 10 soldiers, and then they disguised them as herdsmen. And they told these herdsmen to just, walk around in the fields, in the countryside, and just stumble upon Roman soldiers, Roman scouts, and they were basically spies who would spill the beans to the Romans and tell them that the Samnites were currently attacking the fellow city of Lucara. And so when the Romans found out about this, they were like, right, we're gonna go help Lucara, we're gonna send a small army over there, stop these Samnites, but this was all a ruse, a dastardly trick. The Romans took a route over to Lucara being through the Caudine Forks, which was this narrow mountain passageway, and they entered one side of it, and when they got to the other end, the exit, it was completely barricaded and blocked off. So they sensibly turned around, went back the way they came, and they found that the Samnites had basically trapped them. They had set up barricades on this side as well, and had tons of soldiers outside ready to kill the Roman army. Oops. And so they were trapped in here with no way out. They were running out of food and water and supplies, and the Samnites were kind of surprised that this even worked. You know, it doesn't seem like they even planned for this to work or what they would do afterwards. And so Gaius Pontius, the commander of the Samnites at the time, he sent a letter off to his father asking what they should do. And his father sent a letter back saying to release all of the Romans as quickly as possible. And Gaius was like, really? So he sent another letter to his father asking him to basically clarify, and his father replied, actually just kill every single last one of them. So with these confusing mixed messages, Gaius was like, can we just call him to come down here in person? And so they did. His father came down in person and explained to them that, look, it's basically one way or another. Like, if you let them go immediately, if you don't hurt any of them, you will probably make a great ally in Rome, and they will be, you know, partly indebted to you. You can form a strong alliance or allegiance. But if you slaughter every single last one of them, you will severely cripple Rome to a point where they might not ever be able to recover. And with this, you will gain a huge advantage, be able to take over lands, etc. And his point was, you can do one extreme or the other, but try not to do some sort of a middle ground. Because if you keep them here for ages and then let them go, they'll probably be a bit annoyed. They won't be super friendly with you. But if you go to kill them and don't absolutely destroy them, then Rome will build massive resent against you, and you will be fighting wars for many years to come. And so, according to this historical account, the Romans did surrender because, like, what else could they do? And they set up some peace deals, some peace agreements with the Samnites. But yeah, one of the only battles, I think, in history that's not a battle. No fighting, no deaths, no injuries, just really some sneaky bamboozlements. Locusta was a maestress of poisons who concocted various tinctures, mixtures, poisons, potions designed to obviously kill people. And this was in the 1st century AD, with Empress Agrippina commissioning Locusta to create a poison, and then with this poison she used it to kill her husband Claudius, who was the emperor at the time. And this made Claudius's and her son Nero the new emperor. And after Nero was made emperor, he formed, I guess you could say, a decent business relationship with Locusta, eventually giving her a pardon for a bunch of her crimes and giving her a large country estate on which she kind of started an informal school, and Nero sent to her students to learn the art of poison. But eventually Nero died. The new emperor Galba came in and basically said that Locusta was the scum of the earth. He captured her, took her out in chains through the entire city, with her being executed at the end of it all. And I think it maybe would have been a little more fitting to use her own poison against her, but that's like some Game of Thrones level stuff. But either way, Locusta, a very toxic person. The Pyrrhic War was a war between the Roman Republic and the Greek Epirotes. And this was in around the year 280 BC, and Rome had just won the Samnite Wars. They were slowly taking over more and more land in the Italian peninsula, and one of the cities in southern Italy, named Tarentum, was actually a Greek city. And at the time, apparently, these Roman ships were sailing past. Tarentum ended up attacking these Roman ships, and so Rome declared war on them. And so Tarentum called out for the help of the king of Epirus, King Pyrrhus, and with that the Pyrrhic War was started. And they didn't do too badly, the Epirotes. They won a fair few battles, but one major problem really was that the Romans just had more men. They were kind of like Russia in World War II. And so Pyrrhus, even with doing as well as he did, he couldn't really sustain any more fighting, with him even being quoted by Plutarch the historian as saying that if we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, that we shall be utterly ruined. And this is actually where we get the term a Pyrrhic victory from, which is a victory that, yes, while still technically a successful victory, nevertheless inflicts losses on the winner that they simply cannot sustain, which is probably something like a nuclear war. You know, it's like if we bomb one country and wipe out 90% of their population, but in the battle we only lose 80% of our population. It's like, yes, we have won, I guess, but, you know, at what cost? So it's a victory, but one in which you lose so many men and resources, etc., that it may as well just have been a loss. And after some moving around, eventually the Pyrrhic army retreats back to Greece, allowing Rome to then take over Tarentum, further solidifying their control over the Italian peninsula. Bird Mania is a very strange part of Roman history, where after Julius Caesar starts his civil war and then is killed, which leads to another civil war, which then eventually Octavian wins and becomes the first emperor. Well, after his victory, he returned to Rome and he was approached by a man with a bird. And this bird was trained quite impressively to say the words, "Hail Caesar, Victor Imperator," or "Hail Caesar, victorious leader," referring to Octavian since his middle name was Caesar. And Octavian was so impressed with this bird that he paid the man a stupid amount of money. You know, somewhere in the region of like 8 to 10 years' wages just for this bird. So then he takes the bird, he goes on his merry way, and then he's approached by another man with another bird. And this bird says, "Hail Antony, Victor Imperator," with Antony referring to Mark Antony, the new husband of Cleopatra and Octavian's enemy and rival in these wars. So this second man explains that these two men had got together and they had trained two different birds to praise these two potential winners, so that whoever won, whichever side won, they could sell the bird to the winner and make a bit of money, which is honestly pretty clever. But he said his friend had stolen the bird, went off on his own, and so he demanded half the money that Octavian gave to this other man, and Octavian agreed. He found the man, he divvied out the money, 50-50, and it was pretty ballsy to go up to Octavian with a bird trained to say "Hail Antony." But after this, because of these birds, this kind of started a trend in Rome where people would train up birds to say all sorts of things and then try and sell it, especially to Octavian. And he seemed to kind of promote the idea. He liked these birds saying, positive things or funny things. And this was a time that could be dubbed Bird Mania in Rome. Yama o Hede refers to the kind of obscure theory that says that Wales in the UK is a direct continuation of the Roman Empire, which sounds wild, but just hear me out. So when the Romans invaded Britain, they obviously later pulled out, but a lot of the infrastructure, the buildings, the systems, etc. remained in Britain after the Romans left. So really, the Britons should be the continuation of the Roman Empire, not the Welsh. Except when the Britons were then invaded by the Anglo-Saxons. Back when Britain became Angleland, or what became England, the Britons slowly assimilated into the Anglo-Saxons, and so they lost a lot of their Romanness. But the Welsh, or the Britons on the west side of Britain, they, held fast against the Anglo-Saxon invasion and stayed more or less unconquered by the Anglo-Saxons. So Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Roman Britain fell to the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Normans. But the argument is that Wales stayed strong, and so they are the strongest continuation of the Roman Empire. And this isn't an insanely solid theory to say the least, but it is an interesting one, and it is a fun one, which is good enough to make an entry here. The real King Arthur. So King Arthur is, as you all know, a great king of myth and legend, and this was from the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain. And he is widely thought of not to have existed, but the origins and inspirations for this king might have come from someone who did exist, and that was a man named Lucius Artorius Castus, who was a Roman military commander who served in Britain in the 3rd century. And there are a ton of interesting details kind of linking these two figures, from the obvious similarity in their names, Artorius to Arthur, to the small group of elite Sarmatian cavalry who used to serve under Artorius, which perhaps evolved in this myth into the Knights of the Round Table, to them fighting under a red dragon banner, which perhaps influenced some of the myths about fighting dragons, or influenced Arthur's family name Pendragon. There are a bunch more smaller connections and similarities between the two, from like Arthur's backstory and history to the Sarmatian myths and legends, but honestly, I'm kind of on board with this one. It would make sense for someone like this to be talked about and discussed, perhaps even made into legend. And this is often how stories and myths and legends get created, get passed around, and get blended with some other myths and stories, like for example the history of Merlin, who we covered in the alternate history iceberg. Sponsianus was a potential usurper to the Roman Empire in around the mid-200s AD. But the odd thing is that we don't really have much evidence of them or of their existence outside of a few coins. And these were these gold coins that were found that bore the marking of Imp for Imperatorus, or in English, leader, commander, emperor, and there were no written accounts of him, no historical accounts, and so historians didn't even know about him until these coins were found. And the theories say that either these coins were a forgery, either at the time or at a later date, or perhaps after Rome left the area of Dacia, there was a power vacuum, maybe a rich man named Sponsiani wanted to become leader, and so, as normally happened with the succession of rulers, they printed a bunch of coins with their faces on, with their names on, and this helped kind of push and solidify their rule. So maybe he did this, he printed some coins, but he was swiftly taken down, so swiftly that he was never really remembered or written about, but obviously the coins have survived to this day. Liqian, and I will mispronounce a few of these names, so apologies in advance, but this is a reference to a quite obscure theory that says that after the Battle of Carrhae between the Romans and the Parthians, that the Parthians captured and took as slaves many of the Roman soldiers, and after they were captured, they were sold as, slaves, as mercenaries in the Far East. And this theory comes at least in part of some accounts of Western mercenaries fighting in China at the time. And this was in the Battle of Jiji between the Chinese and the Zhonghu. And in this account, there's mention of these mercenaries using a fish scale formation to fight. And so this could be, the Roman phalanx, because they were sold halfway across the world. They had to make some sort of a living, and they did that doing the only thing they knew how at the time, which was fighting in the Roman style. Then the theory goes that these mercenaries stayed there, they ended up settling down, living there, having kids, etc. And so some of the residents in Liqian today are actually descendants of these Roman soldiers. It is a bit of a headcanon theory, as there's not too much solid, respectable evidence for it, but it is still a very fun one to think about. Tarpeian Rock was a rock or a cliff that was used in the ancient Roman times as a method of execution for criminals. And it was around 8 to 10 stories high. It was off the edge of Capitoline Hill in Rome, and it was first used when the Roman maiden Tarpeia, she apparently let into the city some invading Sabines, and as punishment for this, when she was caught, she was thrown off this rock to her death. And so it became known as the Tarpeian Rock and was used as a punishment with criminals being thrown off it. The Serpent of Bagrada was a very interesting, somewhat insane account of a giant 120-foot serpent or snake that rose out of the river Bagrada in northern Africa during the First Punic War between obviously Rome and Carthage. It then attacked General Marcus Atilius Regulus and killed and ate a few of his troops until they fought back against the creature. They buried it in stones, killing it, and then they skinned it and sent this 120-foot long snakeskin back to Rome as proof. And there are obviously theories about whether this snake actually existed and whether the men did actually see it, and whether or not this was a snake or serpent or a dragon, as back in these times these two words were kind of used interchangeably, with Draco or Draco meaning serpent or dragon, or serpenty dragon or dragony serpent, and it is a very interesting, unique one, so let me know what you think about this in the comments below. Silbannacus was another Roman emperor that I think time forgot, and he was around during the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, which, if you'll recall, had dozens of emperors and leaders kind of coming in and out of power. One rules for 60 days, then is assassinated, then another guy comes in for 2 weeks, and it was like this over and over and over again. So as you can imagine, there might have been a few emperors that were so short-lived that they weren't even talked about. And Silbannacus seems to be one of those emperors. We only really know about him because of these coins that we found, you know, bearing his name, bearing his resemblance. But did he rule for a month, a day, 2 days, 3.5 weeks? We are not entirely sure. The Claudian Letters. Now, this is a rabbit hole that I've just wasted the better part of an hour researching, and I'll leave a link below if you want to read into some more alphanumerics and, you know, the origins and evolutions of words and letters, etc. It's all incredibly fascinating stuff. But this entry refers to the Roman Emperor Claudius, who introduced these letters into the Roman alphabet. And they were used mostly during his reign, but soon enough fell out of use after his death. So he wasn't very successful, but he was probably inspired by a man named Appius Caecus, who hundreds of years earlier had, for one, removed the letter Z from the alphabet, which was at the time zeta. It was the 7th letter in the alphabet, but due to usage, due to some pronunciations of certain words changing over time, this letter became more and more useless. So Appius was like, we don't need Z, take it out of the alphabet, and he did, and nothing really much changed, and replaced it with a new letter that he came up with, that being G, which we obviously still use to this day. He also removed the letter S, which is an entirely different story, but years later, due to Rome borrowing more and more Greek words and, you know, Greek pronunciations, etc., they had to borrow some Greek letters, and these were Y for upsilon and Z for zeta. So they did bring Z back, but obviously putting it back in the 7th place now was a bit awkward. So they just stuck Y and Z onto the end of the alphabet, and that is why they're at the end. The Civil War of 425 was a war with a very strange ending. So at the time, the east and the west sides of the empire were obviously at war. The east sent an army over to the west to kind of take them over, and the west managed to capture one of the Eastern Roman generals. And instead of killing him or putting him in a dungeon or something, they just kept an eye on him, they kept him there, and they treated him fairly decently. You know, they let him kind of walk around and chill and eat bagels and stuff. And the reason for this is, we're not entirely sure. It might have been like a goodwill gesture to the east of like, yes, we captured your guy, but we're gonna treat him decently, you know, show some mercy on us. Maybe there's some deal or arrangement that we can make. And in being given this freedom, the general was able to, as I said, generally kind of walk around, and he ended up talking to a bunch of Eastern soldiers, guards, and convincing them to come over to the side of the east. And so when the rest of the east actually managed to come over to the west, there were certain defensive garrisons that were supposed to, you know, hold strong and keep the east out, and they just basically opened their gates and let the Eastern army right in. The Western Roman Emperor Joannes was captured and then killed, and it was the strangest series of events and end to this civil war where there wasn't really even a fight. It was just bad management by the Western Roman Emperor. He lost to a bunch of internal propaganda, and then they just walked straight in, killed the emperor, and that was more or less it. Vetranio was an interesting character who kind of declared himself emperor and basically became a usurper, but he just kind of did it as a prank. And there was this emperor named Constantine the Great, which we have covered a few times in this iceberg, and he, I guess, must have liked his name so much that he used it to rename a bunch of things. One example being the renaming of Byzantium to Constantinople, and also his kids he named Constans, Constantina, Constantius, and Constantine. Like, Jesus Christ, dude, relax. Oh, and he also had a daughter named Helena, but we don't talk about Helena. And just a quick note that we actually refer to his children as, for example, Constans I, Constantius II, Constantine II, but in their time, when they were born, when they lived, they generally only went by their first name. So they wouldn't have been Emperor Constans II or Constantine II, etc. They just would have been Emperor Constans or Constantine. And this is like a modern invention, just so we can look back and differentiate these various rulers, these various kings from one another. But basically, Constantine the Great died, and he left his empire to his children. And fast forward a few years, and Constans I is ruling the western side of the empire, and his brother Constantius is ruling the eastern side. And Constans in the west is like super unpopular. The brothers actually, in their rise to power in the early years, they ended up killing a bunch of potential competitors to the throne, being among others 2 of their uncles and 6 of their cousins. So yeah, they were brutal dudes. Constans wasn't that popular. And then this man, Magnentius, he ends up killing Constans, and he dubs himself emperor and liberator of the people from the rule of the Constans, or the Constantine family. And a fair few people actually accept his rule. You know, he gets support from most of Gaul, from Britannia, and even Africa. And so there is now kind of a civil war between Constantius in the east and the man who killed his brother, Magnentius, in the west. And then there is this man, Vetranio. He pops up in Illyricum and declares himself emperor. So you have seemingly these 3 people vying for power, all declaring themselves emperor of the Roman Empire, and he holds power for like a few months in his little area, and then he sends a letter to Constantius in the east saying, look, I'm not really trying to usurp you, you know, it's just a prank, bro. But he said, I just really don't like Magnentius trying to usurp power and, you know, killing your brother. So, you know, I'm on your side, just come swing by, I'll give you all my troops, I'll let you use this whole area, you know, it belongs to you anyway. But he sent this letter to Constantius, and he actually kept his word. Constantinus rocked up with his army, Vetranio just gave him all of his soldiers, gave him a bunch of stuff, and this in part led to Constantius winning the civil war. And we don't know exactly what Vetranio said, as we don't have too much information on it. And we're also unclear as to Vetranio's motivations, whether, you know, he was genuinely serious about usurping the throne or the emperorship, but then he saw the kind of writing on the wall. He was like, I'm not actually that strong, best just play it off as a prank and team up with Constantius. That could have potentially been the case. Or he did it as a favor to Constantius, or was teamed up with Constantius the whole time, maybe to form like a blockade between the east and the west, you know, to stall out maybe Magnentius, or to discourage him from coming up this way. So a very interesting character and event, and we still don't really know why exactly he did what he did. What have the Romans ever done for us? Is a reference, obviously, to this amazing clip by Monty Python. And this brings up a very good question, honestly, of what did the Romans actually do for us? And there are honestly a lot more things than are listed here. But, for example, the original Roman calendar, as well as the additions with July and August, that was done by the Romans. January and March being named after the Roman gods, as well as stuff like marketing and advertising. Obviously, massive advancements in military tactics, irrigation, plumbing, minus the lead, aqueducts, sewage systems, London, obviously, in England, and Bath and Lincoln, all of which were Roman settlements. Organization, which was probably one of the Romans' great strengths. Architecture, roads, obviously, with actually a bunch of the roads that Rome built being converted into modern day highways. So yeah, that massive, you know, highway or a road. Originally, that route was planned out and the road built by the Romans, and then it became a main road and then eventually converted into a highway, as well as order and peace generally within the Roman-controlled areas at the time, and the uniform spread of ideals and ideas, a uniform language, so the spread of Latin and then later Greek, universal currencies with the Roman coins, the spread of Roman baths and saunas and steam rooms, etc., underfloor heating, as we explored before, medicine, and I mean, there's a reason that guys think of the Roman Empire or Republic or even Kingdom at least 14 times a day. Fiddling while Rome burns is a reference to the Emperor Nero, who we covered earlier in the Iceberg, but during the Great Fire of Rome that lasted roughly 10 days, destroyed 3 out of the 14 Roman districts and badly damaged a further 7. During this Great Fire, Nero was said to have just watched it and played his fiddle, either because he just didn't care, or because he himself had started this fire, and so he was just watching and admiring his own handiwork. And the theories saying that he started this fire say that he loved the Greek architecture and the buildings and the culture, etc. so much that he decided to start a fire, burn down a bunch of Rome, and then rebuild it in the Greek style. The auction of the Roman Empire. So this occurred in something called the Year of the 5 Emperors, and actually there was a Year of the 4 Emperors and also a Year of the 6 Emperors, which just goes to show you how tumultuous and uncertain some of these periods were. But this happened when Commodus, one of the bonkers cruel emperors, he was killed by the Imperial Praetorian Guard, and they put one Pertinax into power. But then they ended up basically killing Pertinax as well, because he didn't go along perfectly with what they wanted. And at this point, the Praetorian Guards were so powerful, they were so in control, that they just basically put up banners saying like, apply here to be emperor, and they sold off their loyalty and basically the empire to the highest bidder. And these guards, they were all about loyalty. You know, loyalty to the emperor, loyalty to the Roman Empire. In fact, they probably felt like part of what they were being paid for was their loyalty. But if there were someone else, another potential emperor, who valued their loyalty more highly, then they're just giving the empire to whoever values loyalty the most. And basically 2 men turned up for this bidding war, Pertinax's father-in-law and a man named Didius. And they basically bid it out with one another, with Didius winning and being named emperor. But he kind of messed up in this, in that he bid more than he had. And so after only 2 months in power, he wasn't able to keep up his payments, and so the Praetorian Guard killed him. So you have the original Emperor Commodus, he was killed, then the guards replaced him with Pertinax, and then he as well was killed. They had a bidding war, Didius won, he became emperor, and then he as well was killed. And then after Didius, 3 more people came to the throne, or to the emperorship, all claiming to be the rightful emperor. You had Septimus Severus, Claudius Albinus, and this guy, whose name I won't say for obvious reasons, but these 3 basically fought it out. Septimus Severus ended up coming out on top and was crowned the 5th and final emperor of that year. Gladiatrices is the plural for gladiatrix, or a female gladiator. Now, it's very strange because we have very little information on them, or, you know, what they really did, how common they were, or in fact, what the Romans called them, because they seemingly didn't really have a name for a female gladiator, as the word gladiatrix comes from a source long after the gladiators ended in Rome. And from what we can tell, they were generally seen as like kind of rare, special, exotic, and they would never have female gladiators versus male gladiators for obvious reasons, but they did sometimes have the female gladiators fight themselves or fight animals, for example, and that is more or less all we know about them. The Lycurgus Cup is this truly amazing little artifact, which was thought to be created sometime in like the 300s AD, and it is honestly a thing of absolute beauty and wonder. It is made from one solid piece of glass with, as you can see, a metal top and bottom, and the carving of this cup, of this solid piece of glass, is so smooth, so intricate, that you can see it depicts the story of Lycurgus, who was a mythical Greek king, and if this and this alone was the cup, it would already be an impressive piece of work. But one of the more amazing things about this cup is that the glass appears green when lit from the front and red when lit from behind. And nobody was really sure how the Romans achieved this until the 1990s, when we were able to do these super in-depth scans of the glass, and what it revealed was nanoparticles. So literally like nanotech stuff. These insanely tiny fine particles of silver and gold mixed in with the glass. And we are talking like 330 parts per million for the silver and 40 parts per million for the gold, which, to put into some perspective, these particles of gold, they are close to the actual size of wavelengths of light, which is like 1/1000th the size of a grain of salt. So stupendously small that we really have no idea how these ancient Romans were able to achieve it. They would seemingly have to like completely vaporize silver or gold and then have the wherewithal, the thought to mix it in with glass to create this type of glass. Or another theory is that they ended up diluting the glass, allowing them to get away with larger particles of gold and silver. Like, say for example, I want to add 10 mil of salt into 100 mil of water, but I only have 20 mil of salt. You could just add the 20 mil in anyway, and then just pour in water to double the amount of water. And so even though you've added more salt, the ratio or parts per million will still be the same. And so the theory goes that they added in small amounts of gold and silver, you know, maybe like silver dust, gold dust, but nowhere near the nanoparticle size. And then once they had this mixture, they just kept adding glass, adding until they added so much glass that it diluted the gold and silver down to a level that was, you know, nano level. But it is absolutely beautiful, and it's actually kept in the British Museum in London. So next time I'm down there, I will take a photograph for all of you, or if you ever come to London, head in there and take a look. Valentinian I's death. So this is just a quick little tale about an emperor named Valentinian I. And long story short, he wasn't a great emperor. He was honestly a bit of a dick, and he had a short temper. And one time he was raising his voice, he was shouting at these people for, among other things, not respecting him as an emperor and, you know, not bowing down to him and following his orders. And from all this shouting, he literally got a brain hemorrhage and died there on the spot. So, death by internal anger. What a way to go. Scholae Palatinae. So, as we've learnt in a few of these past entries, the Praetorian Guard, you know, the elite guard, the personal guards of the emperor and the empire, think like Secret Service or CIA type stuff, they were in around the 300s quite corrupt. And if you'll recall, just around 100 years ago, they assassinated 2 emperors in a row and then sold off the empire to the highest bidder. So when Emperor Constantine came into power, he was like, this is ridiculous, these guys have got to go. And so he abolished the Praetorian Guard. And this was from him trying to disband them, and then the Praetorian Guard kicking up a fuss, which led to a battle between Constantine and the Praetorian Guard. Constantine won that battle, and so he ended the Praetorian Guard and started the Scholae Palatinae. Basically the new private guards with a new structure, with less corruption and more loyalty loyalty to the emperor and the empire, and less political leanings. Priapus was a Roman god for fertility, livestock, fruit plants, gardening, and male genitalia. And I'm blocking out the image here, but if you can tell by the comically large censor bar, all of his paintings and statues basically came with massive, huge dongs. And yeah, that was Priapus. Greek fire is one of those fascinating entries, and it actually inspired, among other things, the wildfire in the Game of Thrones. But this was a weapon used by the Greeks/Romans, as this was in the Byzantine Empire. So the empire was Roman, but a lot of the citizens and the landmass, etc., was in Greece. So it's not clear really where the line between them was. But this fire could be sprayed out of ships. It floated on the water. It also stuck to the ground. You know, it stuck to the sides of ships, stuck to the floor of a ship, the deck. That's the name for it. And we still to this day have no real idea how it was made. The recipe was a closely guarded secret. Everything from the recipe to the process to the usage of this material, of this substance, of the weapons, was all massively compartmentalized. Because if you think about it, it wasn't just, you know, oh, how do I make this fuel? It was, how do I make it? How do I store it? How do I transport it? How do I actually use it in battle? You know, how do I launch it at the enemy? And then how do I make the launcher? How do I make the ship to carry the launcher? So there was loads of different pieces of knowledge to know in this whole process. And the Byzantines made sure that only a few people knew each individual part. So maybe you knew a few ingredients in the recipe for this, but you didn't know the other ingredients. Or you knew how to use these weapons in order to fire the fuel out, but maybe you didn't know how to repair them, or you didn't know how to build the weapons, or how to install them in ships, etc. And this was very clever because it was a incredible technology. And if, for example, someone was captured, maybe they, you know, got one of your scientists, whoever they caught would only know a few pieces of the recipe. Or if they managed to get some of this substance, this fuel itself, maybe by capturing a ship, for example, then they wouldn't be able to build or use any of the weapons in order to fire this fuel. And this actually happened when the Bulgarians in 814, they won a battle, they captured some of the equipment, and they actually managed to take some of the fuel. But because of this gap in knowledge, they basically weren't able to use it, let alone reproduce it. To the point where, as I said, we still don't know to this day how this Greek fire was made. We have some theories from like pine resin to saltpeter, crude oil, quicklime, or even some forms of like early gunpowder, but still we don't really know, and Greek fire to this day remains a mystery. The 9th Legion. So when Rome invaded Britain, they brought with them 4 legions. They brought the 2nd Legion, the 9th Legion, the 14th Legion, and the 20th Legion. And we have records of all of these legions, you know, entering Britain, doing some stuff over here, and then being moved around and eventually leaving Britain, but not of the 9th Legion. We know they arrived in Britain, they were part of the initial force, and we know that they headed north, but there are no accounts of them ever leaving. And the two major theories about this one is that they either got lost or separated from, you know, Rome as a whole. Maybe while they were up in Caledonia, Scotland, they got lost, they got sidetracked, maybe attacked by the barbarians, and then ended up all perishing. Or for some reason they left Britain, maybe went back to Rome, maybe went to Africa or Asia or even Gaul, and either records weren't kept about them for some reason, or they were but were just lost to time. And this first theory some people link with the Hadrian's Wall, in that Hadrian was called over to Britain because their 9th Legion had basically been slaughtered by the barbarians, and so Hadrian made the decision to build this wall and to keep the barbarians north of the wall to avoid anything like this happening in the future. So it's a very strange account, this missing legion, and I think until the day that we find some more evidence, maybe find some written accounts or archaeological evidence, I think until that day it'll probably remain a bit of a mystery. Little Georgie was the very sad case of this skeleton, and this was found in a Roman fort around Hadrian's Wall, and the skeleton belonged to a young boy or girl from the 3rd century. And Roman human burials were actually forbidden at the time in, cities and forts and like built up areas. Humans were typically buried either outside of these areas or cremated. And so it was suspected that whoever, maybe found this body, whoever was responsible for it, and whoever ended up burying it, did so maybe sneakily, definitely illegally, and was meant to cover up a accidental or intentional murder. Tests done on the teeth of this skeleton show that they had very likely spent most of their years in the Mediterranean, which leads to this either being a child of a Roman soldier or just a Mediterranean slave child. But either way, we don't really know what happened to them, and it is an extremely sad case, being killed and buried this far from home. Staurakios was the shortest serving Byzantine emperor at just 68 days. Basically, his dad died in the Battle of Pliska, and he himself was badly injured. So he came back, he got the emperorship from his father, and he did rule as emperor, but because he was so badly injured, they basically took that away from him. His brother-in-law ended up usurping the emperorship, and he was sent off to live in a monastery where he died just a few months later. The Villa of Mysteries. So during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, most of Pompeii and the surrounding cities were destroyed. They were buried under ash and rubble and were basically forgotten about until they were rediscovered and redug up in the 1900s. And in these discoveries, they found what they called the Villa of Mysteries. And this was a villa that was located in Pompeii, or rather just outside Pompeii, kind of like on the outskirts. And it's really kind of a gorgeous and well-preserved villa that contains these painted walls depicting initiation rites or rituals of something we touched on earlier, these mystery religions. And it's really quite an interesting find. The whole topic of Mount Vesuvius and its eruption, etc., is insane. This eruption was absolutely huge, with molten ash flying everywhere and rocks and dust, earthquakes, 700-mile-an-hour winds that turned the air literally hotter than an oven. So you wouldn't want to have been around when this thing went off. But if you want to see like a live action recreation of the Mount Vesuvius eruption, I will leave a link down below to a simulation that someone has made. So definitely check it out if you have a few minutes. Rome was founded in 390 BC. Is kind of a minor theory that says that while Rome was like technically Rome before this, at the time it was partway through the Roman Republic and it had obviously gone through the Roman kingdom. But this theory says that Rome wasn't really Rome, like wasn't the Rome we all know and love, until in 390 BC when the Gauls ended up sacking Rome. And this was an event we covered higher up in the iceberg, where the Gauls came in, they burnt a bunch of stuff in Rome, including any potential documents of the founding of Rome and the Roman kingdom, etc. But this says that after this sacking, the Roman attitude kind of changed, and it became one of conquest, of offensive defense. So they were never gonna let anything like this happen to Rome again. And in order to achieve that, they would spread out, they would invade lands, they would keep the peace all around the lands, and that was their new philosophy. But that only started after the sacking of Rome in 390 BC. At least that's the theory anyway. Tunnel bears is probably the greatest entry I've ever done on any iceberg ever. So during the siege of Themyscira in the 60s and 70s BC, Rome was sieging this city, and in order to try and get around the large fortress walls, they decided to build these tunnels and tunnel underneath the walls and then up into the city, which is a fairly good strategy. And these tunnels that they built were kind of a fair size. They were big enough to have, you know, a soldier or two, big enough to do a bit of combat in. And when the people in the city realized that that's what Rome was doing, they kind of located these tunnels from their own city and they dug down into them, giving them access from their side. And they sent some soldiers down into them to try and fight back to defend the tunnels, which would honestly be kind of weird enough, these underground tunnel fights. But as well as sending down soldiers, they also sent down angry bees, just like a bunch of I don't know where they even get angry bees from. They just had them on hand, I guess. But they got these angry bees, threw them down into the tunnels, and then they got these bears somehow from somewhere, and they led them and pushed them down into these tunnels. So if you're a Roman soldier, you're, you know, cruising across these tunnels. It's all dark down there, it's cold, and you're fighting not only other soldiers, but then hordes of angry bees, tunnel bears charging at you in the dark underground. Like, yeah, how about no? And I just imagine this whole thing as like a break glass for emergency, where they have a massive glass box full of angry bees, and it just says break glass in the event of a Roman invasion of the city via underground tunnels. And then they're like, oh, finally a use for these angry bees. And obviously the same thing with angry bears, just having them on hand. But as I said, probably one of the greatest entries I've ever done. And this strategy didn't work out in the end, because the Romans did eventually end up sieging the city and winning. But it is honestly just some great stuff. And that is all we have time for. I have honestly felt like a bit of a history major or professor these last few weeks. It has been a very, very fun time exploring about and writing these entries. So let me know if you enjoy this sort of topic, these sorts of icebergs. So maybe we can do some more in the future, maybe on ancient Greeks or some other ancient civilizations. Let me know down below which ones you might like to see. And I hope you are all having a lovely day, week, month, and year. I know we're only a quarter way through the year, and as always, thanks for watching.